Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this 1 hour webinar on strategies to enhance reading comprehension. This webinar is presented by the Arizona branch of the International Dyslexia Association. IDA Arizona is a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving individuals affected by dyslexia, language and literacy challenges, and their families and communities that support them until everyone can read. I'm Sam DePaulo. I'm a board member for IDA Arizona, and I will be your moderator today. I'm so glad you could be here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. In today's session, we will be exploring how developing comprehension as a fundamental literacy skill, not just a byproduct of fluency, can help students close academic gaps. You'll learn a little bit about dual coding theory, the Visualizing and Verbalizing or VV program, and practical tools to build concept imagery and improve comprehension skills. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dave Kiyvyra. Dave Kiyvyra is the Director of Development for Lindenwood Bell for Schools. He has worked with districts across the country for over 20 years, helping them develop professional development models to implement Lindenwood Bell practices. He's a passionate advocate for public education and a proud father of 3 boys, 2 of whom have faced challenges learning to read. His experiences both as an educator and as a parent fuel his commitment to creating effective reading programs and supporting schools. We're so fortunate to have Dave with us today to share his expertise. So thank you so much, Dave, for being here with us this morning. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Dave, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate that. Great intro and good morning to everybody. I'm actually joining you from New York City at a conference this week. And so it's a little bit later in the day for me, but good morning to y'all. I hope you have a good cup of coffee and a muffin or something to sustain you. This will be a pretty fun hour, I think. As Sam mentioned, my name is Dave Kiyvyra. I'm Director of Development for Lindenwood Bell for Schools. In the For Schools division, you can think about Lindenwood Bell. We have learning centers where students receive intensive one-on-one instruction. And then we have our For Schools division where we partner with schools to help train teachers in how to implement the programs with their students in typically small group instruction or in whole classroom instruction. So we're going to talk today in particular about really closing the comprehension gap in the science of reading. And so we'll talk a bit about theory. See if I can work my way through my slides. There we go. We're going to talk a little bit about, at its core, what sensory cognitive instruction is and why that's so important. We'll talk about what's called the dual coding theory and how that relates to concept imagery. Our focus is going to be on talking about developing language comprehension, and I'm excited to be able to, toward the end of our presentation, really take a look at some real data showing the differences between students who struggle with decoding and students who struggle with comprehension. So we'll get a chance to really see how that is reflected and what that means for those students and what that means really for the type of instruction that we as educators need to be sure we're providing to our students, right? So this is actually a quote from a couple of years ago from Catherine Nees, who's at OSEP. And she talked about, coming out of the pandemic, the big decline that we saw in the NAEP scores was likely to lead to a lot of potentially inappropriate referrals to special education, right? That the reason why these students were struggling in many cases is because they had missed several years of instruction or amount of time of instruction. The reality is, a couple of years after the pandemic, we really haven't closed those gaps. That's what the test score data is showing nationally. And so for many of those kids, what's unfortunately happening is they're heading into special education. And as my friend Bob Pasternak, we'll have a quote from him again later, he often says, the challenge with special education is that there really often isn't anything special about special ed, right? It is just a place where students go to and they get help with the content, but they don't ever become independent in terms of accessing the content themselves, right? And we know that the brain can only process information through its senses. So when students are struggling, it's critical that we be providing instruction to them at the sensory cognitive level, right? It's about process-based instruction that we need to develop for them rather than content-based instruction, right? Content-based instruction is a helpful scaffold But when you remove that scaffold, the students are not independent if they haven't developed the underlying processes that they need to develop to become independent, right? Um, and, learning how to comprehend oral and written language and decode words is the single most important thing that we have to provide children in school. And very often that isn't something that they actually develop, and that impacts very deeply and profoundly their ability to be successful in life, right? I think the stats on the adult prison population are something like 85% of that population is functionally illiterate, right? So there are reasons why folks have ended up in that situation because they have limited opportunities if they can't independently read and comprehend. And it's been great that there has been this increasing awareness of the fact that there is a lot of science that discusses what are the necessary pieces that you have to develop in order to learn how to read. And much of that science has been around for a long time, so it's been about bringing that science to a level of awareness. One of the things that I've noticed in traveling around the country and going to lots of conferences is that there's a lot of discussion about the science of reading, but it pretty much tends to all be about decoding and decoding and decoding. And there's not a lot of information provided about how to develop reading comprehension, right? And certainly folks know that it's important, but even when you look at something like Scarborough's rope, right? You all can picture Scarborough's rope, I'm sure, if you're joining an Arizona IDA meeting, right? You've got the decoding part of the rope and the comprehension part, and down at that decoding part, we are talking about things like sound symbol correspondences, right? Or orthographic mapping, talking about phonemic awareness. Those are sensory cognitive functions for sure. When you go up to the top part of that reading rope, though, what's listed there, the first things are vocabulary and background knowledge. Those are not sensory cognitive functions, right? So the question is, how do you help load a student's brain so that they can be able to access and develop vocabulary and develop background knowledge? Okay? So Lindenwood Bell's programs at their core, as I'm mentioning, are about sensory cognitive instruction. They are aligned to the science of reading. Some of the initial research that underlies the science of reading discussion was actually conducted on students who received Lindenwood Bell instruction. We would argue it goes beyond the current understanding of the science of reading, in part because it's based on a theory of cognition. So we'll talk about that theory of cognition this morning. The programs that we implement, importantly, are not scripted, right? So that means that they don't say, this is what you do at 2 weeks, this is what you do at 4, and this is what you do at 6, because that doesn't actually allow for differentiated instruction. Now, that's another thing I'm seeing a lot of as I go around the country. Folks are saying this program is a science of reading-based program, and then it's heavily scripted, right? Certainly we have processes, we have a scope and sequence, we have language, but what teachers need to do is develop the pedagogical skill of responding to their students' response in real time by engaging with them Socratically, using that student's errors as a means to help them learn how to problem solve and fix the error themselves so that they can become independent, right? We talk about how what we need educators to do is to really become real-time diagnosticians. And you get to that by engaging Socratically with your students and responding to their responses, right? So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about that. I mentioned the sensory cognitive functions a bunch. So there are 3 of them that we really focus on at Lindenwood Bell. And I often think it's easy if we take just a very basic word and think about that single word in these 3 different ways, right? We know students have to have good phonemic awareness so that they come to the letters C-A-T on the page and they can say at, right? And they can isolate that a is that second sound in the word cat. If it changes to an the word is cut, right? That's good phonemic awareness. Now, my hope is that if my student sounds out the word cat in one paragraph, when they come across that same exact word in the next paragraph, I want them to be able to recognize it right away, not have to sound it out all over again. That comes from what's called good symbol imagery. I know a lot of folks are familiar with talking about orthographic mapping. We talk about symbol imagery as the sensory cognitive function that underlies students' ability to orthographically map, connect sounds and letters and words. So that's also what helps students be able to hold on to all of those very complex words and recognize chunks of multisyllabic words very quickly. Concept imagery is the ability to create, as I talk about, a movie in your mind for language as it's coming in, right? So again, if we go back to that same sort of word cat, concept imagery is the ability to picture that a cat is a furry animal with pointy ears and a long tail, right? So if you think about it with just that very basic word, in order to read and understand a passage about a cat, students have to be able to access these three very distinct cognitive functions. And if they have a weakness in any one of them, that's going to impact their ability to derive meaning from that passage, right? And just a little bit more in depth on the concept imagery piece. I talk about concept imagery, as I mentioned, the ability to make a movie in your mind. I talk about that with when folks sit down and you read a book, right? You're able to put that book down, walk into the other room, and be able to summarize what it was that you just read. That's because you've got that movie going on in your head. And if any of you all out there have ever had a book that you really loved turned into a movie, I bet you've had the experience where when you went to the movie, you were watching it and you're like, well, that doesn't match. That's not what the character looked like. They left out this whole part. Oh, they added in this other piece that wasn't even in the book. So that experience that you're having is you're taking that movie that you created in your mind and comparing it to the movie that's up there on the screen. That's what good concept imagery is. Okay? These sensory cognitive functions obviously all have to integrate, right? We can think about them in isolation, but they have to be integrated together in order for a student to be a complete reader. So they've got to have good auditory skills to sound out words. They also have to have good orthographic processing to recognize them and hold on to them. They've got to have good vocabulary so that they can develop contextual reading and fluency. And all of those feed into the whole point of reading, which is comprehension. And in fact, there are students who decode absolutely fine, but still don't comprehend what it was that they just decoded. Okay? And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to take a look at some data of some students who are exactly fitting in that camp, right? So mentioned earlier the theory of cognition called the dual coding theory. There's lots of research and lots has been written about the dual coding theory, so you can certainly look it up. Talks about how the dual coding theory is a sort of unified, scientifically based theory of literacy. And what the dual coding theory posits is that we can understand things to the extent that we can correlate or align language with mental representations, right? So when I say the word cat to you, you can picture the letters for the word cat, and you can picture what a cat looks like. And you can also take the movie that you've got in your mind and use your language to such an extent that it creates the same movie in my mind. And individuals are going to really vary in terms of how easily they can access those abilities, right? So we think about imagery, right? If we're going back to that dual coding theory, it's talking about matching mental representations or images with language. We can think about how there are two different types of imagery, right? Symbol imagery, which is that ability to figure out what are the individual sounds and letters within a word like clown, and how can I hold on to those so that I can recognize that word and I can spell that word. And then there's concept imagery, which is, again, what is it that a clown looks like? It's setting aside sounds and letters for the word, but just being able to picture that in your mind for oral and written language comprehension, right? So if we think really briefly about symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, right? Examples of students struggling with that are those samples that we see all the time in the classroom, right? A kid looks at a word like snakes and they say steaks, and they can't auditorily perceive that they've put the wrong sound in there, and they can't recognize that they're providing that it should be a different letter if it's going to be steaks rather than snakes, right? And it's key to go through and help them be able to problem solve that, right? Just to quickly give you a sense of what that problem solving looks like, if my students were to look at a word like snakes and say steaks, the first thing I would do is cover over the word so they're not looking at it anymore, and then give them some positive reinforcement, like great job with your S saying S. When you say steaks, what do you picture for your second letter? If my student says steaks, well, I'm picturing a T. I can give them more positive reinforcement. Great job with the T there, that word would say steaks. Now I can uncover the word and say, what do you see for your second letter here? Oh, it's an N. Great, so what does that word say? Snakes, right? And by not telling them the correct answer from the start, not telling them, nope, that didn't say steaks, it says snakes. By going through a very intentional process, I'm helping them learn how to problem solve and become independent. And it's really amazing to see the light bulb go off for students when they recognize that they can fix those errors themselves, right? So we've talked a bit about what symbol imagery is. It's a form of static imagery, right? And I asked you guys if you had your coffee this morning. So we'll do a quick exercise. And Sam, I might call on you for this. All right. So I know this is a total nonsense word. And I'm going to show it to you guys and then take it away. And Sam, what did that word say?
I think it said flisp.
Flisp. Nice job. Absolutely. What was
Okay.
this? What was the, I'm going to say, what was that third letter that you pictured?
I.
I. Great. What if you change that I to an A? What would it say?
Lasp.
Lasp. Nice job. Last tough question. What if you switch those last two letters around? What would the word say now?
Flaps.
Flaps. Nice work. That was awesome, right? So I never showed Sam. Nice job, Sam. I never showed Sam that word again, right? She's having to picture that word in her mind. We're doing some phonemic awareness exercises where we're changing the letters, and she's having to come up with the word that results from that. And to the extent that you can do those types of exercises, that correlates, we know through research, to how well it is that you can read, right? And when students are struggling with symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, they show up in a lot of these different ways, right? And these are pretty common things that we see. Students who have trouble sounding out words, students who have trouble holding on to sight words, maybe they can phonetically spell words, but they can't come up with the one correct orthographic pattern for it. A lot of these students know that they're making mistakes, but they don't have a way to fix those mistakes themselves. And so reading becomes extremely frustrating for them, especially the older they get, right? And especially when we start to peel back how much actual reading instruction we're doing in the classroom. In some cases, these students are labeled as students with dyslexia. In other cases, they're not, and they may be presenting exactly the same, right? Okay. So we think about imagery as related to a whole imagery language processing spectrum, right? That there are students who struggle with decoding, classically might be labeled as students with dyslexia. And then at the other end, you've got students who struggle with comprehension. At the far end of that, they may be labeled as students with autism. Many students with autism are hyperlexic, right? And think about that as the opposite of dyslexic. They can decode anything, but they can't comprehend what it was that they just decoded. And then it is a spectrum. So you've got students sprinkled throughout here with varying degrees of strengths and weaknesses. And so it's really key as we think about this Venn diagram to be thinking about what kind of data do I have on my student to tell me why it is that they're struggling, right? Because in a real world context in a school, often what people might be looking at is map data, right, for older students. MAP is telling you that the student is struggling with reading comprehension. Ultimately, that's what it's telling you. But it's not telling you, are they struggling with weak reading comprehension because they have difficulty decoding? Or are they decoding successfully, but they can't comprehend what they're decoding, right? And those are two different types of students. And you'd want to be doing two different types of intervention with them, right? So there again is our sort of discussion about the parts and the wholes. We've dealt with the parts. Now we're going to talk in more detail about how to develop concept imagery for the whole, right? And concept imagery is not a new idea. It goes all the way back to Aristotle talking about memory or remembering as a state induced by mental images. Einstein talked about if I can't picture it, I can't understand it. And I think that that is so really true, right? I mean, it hits. And what's happening for a lot of kids is not that they don't have any comprehension, right? But it's rather that, you know, the language is kind of coming in one ear and going out the other ear, and they're holding on to bits and pieces of it. Oftentimes, you know, students will memorize place names or dates or things like that as a compensatory technique, but they can't hold on to the entire passage, so they can't do the sort of higher order thinking that we want them to do, right? And often what happens in school is if a student can't answer the main idea about a passage after reading the passage, what do teachers say to the students to do? Yep. Go back and read it again, right? Well, going back and looking at exactly the same words again isn't going to somehow magically help my student be able to understand what it was that they just read. They're going to get more frustrated. They're going to start to memorize some of the words, and many kids will write down the words verbatim from a passage. But again, they can't get to the main idea. So how do we build that ability to hold on to? What is it that helps you hold on to that language so it's not coming in one ear and going out the other? It really is that ability to create the movie that we were talking about before, that concept imagery, that as we sit down and read a book, we're able to create, as Nancy Bell calls it, an imaged gestalt. That's our nice German word of the day, meaning whole. And once you've got that whole, now you can start to answer main idea questions and draw conclusions and make inferences, right? But for a lot of students, their experience in reading might be similar to the experience that I have when it's very late at night and I'm tired and I sit down to read. Y'all probably do a similar thing sometimes. You get down to the bottom of the page and what do you say to yourself? Well, remember anything I just read, right? And it's not that I had any trouble decoding it. I decoded all of those words, but I wasn't engaged in that intentional practice of creating the images for it. So I can't remember what it was that I just read. Now, symptoms of weak concept imagery show up in many, many more places than a weakness in terms of decoding does, right? Because weak concept imagery is global. It affects not just reading comprehension, but also oral language comprehension. So if I'm reading it to my student, they still may not understand it. That impacts their ability to think critically and problem solve. So think about who your students are who really struggle with problem solving, right? Other places that might show up is the students in your class or that you work with who have real difficulty holding on to multiple step directions, right? They can hold on to one direction, maybe two, but not multiple step ones. Difficulty expressing language orally, which really underlies the ability to express language in writing. Here's a challenge that I think that we face at school. Most of the time, what we're asking students to produce in terms of work is in written form, right? We're asking them to write it. But if we don't take time to make sure that they can actually verbalize what they're going to write, then we're in a losing battle, right? Because now when we focus on writing, we're talking about, handwriting, spelling, punctuation, grammar. All of that stuff is nice, but it's not the critical piece of writing. The critical piece of writing is, can I communicate what it is that I'm thinking? And it's much more important to be able to do that verbally and have that underlie good writing. Difficulty interpreting social situations, cause and effect. One of the big areas where I think it shows up a lot is around teachers feeling like students aren't paying attention in class, right? And many students might be labeled as having attention-related issues. We kind of think about, rather than saying the student doesn't understand what's happening in the class because they're not paying attention, we think about flipping that and saying the reason the student's not paying attention is because they don't understand what's happening in the classroom. And so until we can alleviate that, they're not going to just magically sit there and attend to what it is that the teacher is saying, right? And for many of these kids, what happens, unfortunately, is that they get very frustrated and they begin to act out that frustration, right? This is a quote by my friend Bob Pasternak, who talked about, the number one reason students are referred to special ed is because they're struggling to learn how to read. The second is behavior problems. And the main reason why they have behavior problems is because they're struggling to learn how to read, right? It's actually not complicated. And I lived the exact experience with my second child. He really struggled to learn how to read. And the school put in place all kinds of different behavior plans to try to deal with his negative behavior that was sprouting from that. But at its core, his issue was that he couldn't learn how to read. Until we could address that, he wasn't going to be happy in class, no matter what kind of behavior plan you put together for him. The wonderful thing is we were able to get him the help he needed. And now my kid, who I lived in absolute fear of what would happen for him when he went to middle school, skips happily off in the morning to go to middle school. He loves going to school. He's excited to go and do the work because now he can read. But if I hadn't gotten him that help, I can tell you guys, he's African-American. African-American kids who struggle with reading in second grade and then third grade and then fourth grade are overrepresented in behavior classrooms, right? Because that's how they get listed as, right? Or thought of. So, giving you a lot of sort of background, now I want to talk in more detail about some specific data and how you can see this difference between students who struggle with decoding and students who struggle with comprehension. And we're going to take a look at some data from Fort Smith Public Schools in Arkansas. The district as a whole has about 15,000 kids. It's a Title I district, very high English learner population. And we partnered with them for several years to implement Seeing Stars and Visualizing and Verbalizing across all tiers. So it was used in Tier 1 whole classroom settings in K through 2, and then as an intervention for kids in Tier 2 and Tier 3, as well as in special ed. And for the data set that we're going to take a look at, we're going to look at about 1,200 kids. These kids all performed below the 20th percentile on the MAP test, right? So they're taking that as their initial draw to say, kids performing under the 20th percentile, these are my students I'm going to be concerned about. We need to provide intervention for them, right? So we took those 1,200 kids and gave them a really extensive battery measuring all the different parts of reading, right? Their symbol imagery, their phonemic awareness, their word attack, spelling, then having them read passages where we got rate, accuracy, and fluency scores from, and then we asked them questions about that passage and get a comprehension score, and then separately measured their receptive vocabulary, right? These are all nationally normed, publicly available assessments that we used. And so you can see for these students, these are kids who had demonstrated a real difficulty in terms of decoding. All of these different parts of reading are really difficult for them. And that shows up in their reading accuracy being at the 6th percentile, right? And the quote unquote normal range, by the way, for these assessments is the 25th to the 75th, right? So these kids are way below in their reading accuracy. And so they're struggling to accurately read a passage. But when I ask them questions about that same passage, they're scoring at the 18th percentile. So even though they can't figure out what a lot of those words say, they can still understand some of what that passage is. So these are kids who, if I read them the passage, they'd probably understand it, right? Their score would be even higher. If we come down and we look at this other group of kids coming from the same overall pool, these are kids who, when we look at their decoding scores, these are well within the normal range, right? These are great decoding scores. Reading accuracy is at the 37th percentile. And yet when we ask those same kids questions about the passage, their comprehension is at the 16th percentile, right? So they're comprehending a passage, even though they can decode it wonderfully, at the same, almost exactly the same way that kids are comprehending a passage when they can't decode any of the words, right? And yet they come up with a completely different profile. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? And so again, when we think about big data assessments like MAP, like iReady, all of these other assessments that we're using, if we're only thinking about that big umbrella, how are they doing with their reading comprehension, then we're potentially missing the boat. And if we're saying, let's just take all of those kids below the 20th percentile and give them an intervention program, it's going to be a match for some kids, but it's not going to be a match for other kids. Make sense? Right? There's something else that I found really interesting about this too. And y'all might have noticed this, but the average there's a lot more students that you can see with decoding weaknesses than with comprehension weaknesses, right? So that's one thing that stands out. One reason is because there's a lot more measures of decoding than there is comprehension. The other is that the average age of these kids with decoding weaknesses is they're 9-year-olds, right? For these comprehension kids, they're not recognized for this until they're 12, right? So 3 full years later, and that's because these kids can decode, and that's what people have been looking for. Can the kid decode? And we're not digging deep enough because these kids didn't all of a sudden develop a language comprehension weakness. It's been there for a while. And these are 12-year-olds now headed off into middle school for whom they've not been accessing the content for several years now, right? And that means they're going to be way behind and they're going to be very frustrated going into middle school. Okay? When we got these students about 52 hours of instruction, what we saw was they made statistically significant gains across all of the measures. So you're seeing the pre-test in light blue, the post-test in dark blue. And so you saw the decoding students make really great gains in those parts of reading, which tied over to more growth in their reading comprehension. And then the comprehension students, they actually grew some in their decoding too, but most importantly, where they grew was a big jump in their reading comprehension, right? And so when we look at it in terms of standard score changes, so the size or the significance of those changes, this is for the decoding students making big gains in all of those parts of reading. And then for the comprehension students, again, making a little bit of growth in accuracy and fluency, but really it's showing up in comprehension, right? And I will emphasize that a lot of folks do provide students with intervention and decoding, and the ultimate hope is that their students are going to develop fluency. Fluency comes from comprehension. It doesn't come from more decoding. Students can have a very well-developed sight word base. All of those things are important, but if they don't understand what they're reading, they're not going to have a good fluency score, right? It really does come from that piece of it, right? Okay, so we're doing pretty well on time. Sam, I don't know if there were any questions in the chat so far.
The only question it looks like is the handout that was provided with the 8 tips to enhance comprehension. If there was
Yeah.
another handout to go specifically with these slides, or perhaps people should be taking more notes, I think.
Yeah, so I don't have a handout for these slides. What we did put in the chat earlier was links to 2 different presentations that we did for the Virginia State Department of Education. One is on Seeing Stars program, the other is on Visualizing and Verbalizing. And so a lot of this content is in those. And then this presentation is also being recorded, so you can have the opportunity to come back to this. I apologize, I don't have handouts of the slides.
Totally fine. Thank you. And Mary's putting those
Yeah.
links to the videos in again. So check
Great.
out the chat box for those links, and then the recording will be posted later. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so the big question that I know we all want to walk away with is, great, this is great information, Dave. I got it, decoding, comprehension, dual coding theory, all that stuff. But what do I do? Like, how do I develop concept imagery, right? And so I think one of the fun exercises to think about is changing the language and the way that we as educators are interacting with our students, right? I mentioned much earlier on, the programs are not scripted, but we do have steps, and we do have specific language that we want educators to be using to consciously and intentionally develop imagery, right? And concept imagery in this case. And that plays out in terms of even something as basic as vocabulary development, right? Because when we're thinking about vocabulary development, historically, at least what my dad would have always said to me was, go look it up in the dictionary, son. And so if I wanted to know the definition of a gorilla, I'd have to go look it up, right? We'd suggest a pivot in your language to saying, what do you picture for a gorilla, right? Now my student can start to describe what it is that they're picturing for a gorilla. And this is actually really important for English language learners who may not know the vocabulary for how to describe a gorilla, but they can still picture one. And so they can use gestures or provide the word in their native language, and we can translate it for them, right? And gesturing is a big sign of imagery, right? A gorilla is a big animal, it's got long arms. And all of those gestures are a sign of imagery, right? If you've ever seen students, many students with autism who really struggle to comprehend language, they don't gesture very much. It's a good sign that they're not imaging, right? So changing your language is really important, because the reality is that when you go and you look up a definition of a gorilla, this is what you end up with, right? A very large, typically black-colored anthropoid of equatorial Africa that has a stocky body, broad shoulders, and long arms, and is less erect than or smaller ears than a chimpanzee, right? Which is a real mouthful for kids to try to understand. And it's got vocabulary in there that if they are struggling with a word like gorilla, I'm not sure that calling it an anthropoid is going to help them be able to picture it or understand it any better. And certainly if I'm having trouble picturing a gorilla, comparing it to a chimpanzee also probably isn't going to help, right? And so using language such as, what do those words make you picture, And then using choice and contrast questions and gestures are what's going to really help students be able to develop that concept imagery, right? And it's important when we think about passages as educators, and we're going to do a passage together as a team. We think about what happens when we're reading through passages. As the teacher, I want to be working from parts to the whole, right? So we actually typically do a step called sentence by sentence, in which we take a paragraph and we break it down into its component parts, the individual sentences, help students create a picture for each of those sentences, then go back and provide a picture summary, turn that picture summary into a word summary, so they reverbalize it using their pictures to help them recall what happened, and then get into a main idea, right? It's important for teachers, for us as educators, to have pre-read the passage to ourselves so we know where it's going, and that we can question toward the gestalt of the passage, right? One of the things we don't want to do is over question to irrelevant details, right? We want to question to the really important things, okay? All right, so we're going to do an exercise together, as I was just talking about. And if y'all are at home, if you want to, we use colored squares to represent each of the pictures. You can put down a colored square or an object to help you hold on to how many pictures it is that you created. And I'm going to be, Sam, I'm going to put you on the spot again. I'm going to be interacting with you to talk about some of these questions, okay?
Great.
All right, let's try. So again, this is content that might typically be used in an intervention setting. And when you have recognized that a student has a weakness in concept imagery, it's important to take the time to move to content that is going to be helpful in terms of imagery and generating imagery, and start with that rather than start sometimes with the classroom content material that may not be very easy to image for. So I chose a story to do with y'all that's going to be very high in imagery, because I want to get you guys started on this task with something that's fun and really engaging and really easy to picture, right? Before we start applying it over to chemistry text, okay? All right. So it's a grade 2 story, and it's called A Fishy Snack. Young men once held contests to see who could eat the most live goldfish. One by one, they grabbed the wiggling fish from a tank. What do those words make you picture, Sam?
Picture a group of boys,
Mhm.
maybe like teenage or college age boys. Um, I picture tanks or bowls with water and goldfishes in them.
Yeah, and which do you want to go with, tanks or bowls?
Let's go with bowls.
Okay, okay. So they've
Bowls
each
of,
got
yep.
like bowls in front of them, okay?
Hmm.
And then what do you picture them doing?
I picture them reaching into the bowls and
Yeah,
pulling out a fish, and it's squirming all around.
yeah, nice. And what color do you picture the fish?
Bright orange.
Bright orange, yeah, because it did say it was a goldfish, so it's probably bright orange. And where are you picturing these boys? Are they just like, are they in a school, in a car? Where do you picture them?
I picture them in uh let's see, I picture them in a kitchen with a big kitchen table and all the
Oh, okay.
bowls are lined up in front of them. Sorry, it's my
Okay.
dog.
All right, cool. It said it was a contest. So I had pictured that they were up on a stage and there were maybe some banners around them to help me hold on to the idea that it was a contest. But, there's nothing to say that it couldn't potentially be in your kitchen. Your words made me picture that there were a whole bunch of goldfish bowls lined up there. And so I just want to go back and see if that matches. It says young men once held contests to see who could eat the most live goldfish. One by one, they grabbed the wiggling fish from a tank. It does say tank,
Oh,
so maybe we need to change our picture for that.
good point.
Yeah, so
Okay,
what are
now
you
I'm
picturing
picturing
if
it
it's a
different.
tank?
I'm picturing now it's somebody's house and they're doing a contest amongst themselves, kind of
Okay.
egging each other on. And there's a big tank on maybe like a side table in a maybe it's still the kitchen,
Yep,
and they're all gathered around it.
great. And are you picturing just one goldfish in there, or are there a whole bunch of goldfish in the tank?
A whole bunch.
Yeah, a whole bunch. Great. So Hopefully you guys notice that I'm trying to make sure I question to the relevant details in here, right? The most important things that need to be pictured for. And getting a little bit of detailed imagery for things, but I'm not, beating it to death by over questioning, right? If Sam's got the main things, that's great. If something from Sam's picture isn't matching the text, again, I don't tell her, no, that's wrong, you have to change it. Instead, I say, great, hold on to your picture. That's a great picture. Let's go back and see if that matches our sentence. And now I can go back and read the sentence to her again and say, now, is there anything you want to change about your picture? Okay. And as Nancy Bell would emphasize, you want to be questioning from the subject to the verb to the object, right? And thinking really consciously and intentionally about providing that type of questioning. And so always when we read a passage to students, we read a chunk to students, we're saying to them at the end, what do those words make you picture? Well, often they're like, oh, I don't know. Well, so then you got to jump in and start to ask some questions, right? And notice the questions I asked weren't yes, no questions for Sam. They're choice and contrast questions, right? I'm trying to engage her Socratically, help her build her vocabulary, and help her build her imagery. All right. Okay, we all good so far? All right. So we're going to keep on going. Next sentence. All right, one by one, they grabbed the wiggling fish from a tank. They dropped the fish in their mouths and swallowed. What do those words make you picture, Sam?
I picture them all lined up and holding it like this and
Uh-huh.
going gulp.
Yep. And the it that they're holding is what?
That bright orange goldfish.
That bright orange goldfish. Great. And they're dropping it in their mouths. And then I love your word gulp. Show me what that would look like when they're gulping it.
Gulp.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome. Awesome. All right. Anything else you think we need to add to it? Same kids by that big tank?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. All right. Next one. Next sentence. The crowd cringed as each man gulped as many fish as he could. Some men ate too many fish and got sick. So now what do those words make you picture, Sam?
Oh, now I'm back to what you were thinking, and I think
Yeah.
it is on a stage in front of an audience. There's a crowd.
Yeah.
It's not just them making a contest, but yeah, there's a crowd. There's an audience. So they're up on the stage
Yeah.
now, and everybody did what I just said, which was ew.
Yep. And if they're gulping as many fish as they can, what are you seeing them do? Are they doing just one fish at a time, one fish
Oh
or
no, definitely both
awesome.
hands.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And how about for that last part? They ate too many fish and got sick.
Oh, I see them running off the stage going, "Mm."
Yeah. Nice. All right. Great.
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah. Good morning out there in Arizona
Too
with
graphic.
your coffee and everything. Um, but that's very intentional, right? I got everybody's attention with a story like this. Think about your students. You've got to be able to get their attention with something if you're going to have them do this sort of hard work. Now, I did make a mistake in that whole process, right? Because I'd forgotten, I didn't review my slides enough in detail this morning. I should have made sure Sam changed her picture from the start to some kids, some people up on a stage, right? Because it was ultimately going to be about a contest and there was going to be a crowd out there watching the kids do this task. And so I did need to be able to make sure that that idea is implanted from the start rather than Sam having to do that weird change at the end where she's like, oh, now I do picture them up on the stage, right? Though, having said that, that is more of an advanced skill, right? That your images change as you get new information. It's just that when I first start the process with students, I might want to front load that a little bit more. Does that make sense? Great.
That was great,
Um,
Dave. And there's a couple of questions in the chat if I can chime
yeah,
in. That
dynamite.
was
Go for
really
it.
fun. Thank you. I like
Yeah.
that cognitive exercise was great. Um, Timmy's asking, when presenting a concept imagery exercise, are you doing it auditorily first and then sharing the print after they've created the
Mm.
image in their mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, so you can do it either way. I usually like to do it just auditorily first, but there's nothing wrong with having each of the sentences as it comes in out there. What I don't want to have is the whole paragraph out there and then work parts to whole because my kids are going to skip down to the end, right? So I want them to just see one sentence at a time. And because it's about creating the images for them, I'm not worried. Some of my kids, yes, I'll say, read the first sentence. Young men once held contests to see who could eat the most live goldfish. What do those words make you picture? Some students are going to say, I picture young men holding contests to see who could eat the most live goldfish. That's great. Those are the words. Now, what does that look like? Right. And I need to really start to engage with them. Other kids will do the opposite thing. And they'll be like, I have a goldfish and I tried to eat it. And and they start to go off on it. Again, you got to bring that kid back as well. Right. And so that comes from that sort of that ability to differentiate your instruction based on what the students are showing you in real time as their particular weakness. Right. So that's a great question.
Classic. And there's a follow-up question
Yeah.
from Adria. When doing the sentence by sentence, like you mentioned, do you keep the visualizing, verbalizing structure words on hand for them, or do you just ask questions based on those 12 words?
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate, was that Audria? Audrey's got some experience with the program. It sounds like that's dynamite. And so, yes, we do use some structure words. There are 12 of them: what, size, color, shape, movement, number. And it goes on into, it gets a little bit more abstract. We practice with those on some steps ahead of this step. And so that when we get to this, those should be embedded in what they're doing. The first couple times that we do it, we use them. But otherwise, my hope is that they've been embedded. Now, if I'm a classroom teacher, I think it's great to have those structure words up on the wall, because you could actually be using those all day, right? Across different content areas, and especially when it comes time to writing, right? When students say things like, I don't know what to write. Well, use your structure words. Go take a look at your structure words and see if you can use those to help you write, right? And the next step after we do this, we've built those pictures, is to then go back and get what we call a picture summary. So the students would be touching these different colored squares that they put down and going back and saying, here I saw, here I saw, here I saw, and here I saw. And then we say, great, now that you've got those pictures in your mind, I'm going to collect the colored squares. You hold on to your pictures and tell me the story back in your own words. And when they get lost, rather than saying, so if they're like, and then they dropped the fish in their mouths and they swallowed, and I don't remember what happened next, rather than saying, well, that was the third sentence. It's the third sentence. Instead, I'm going to say, yeah, this is where you pictured some other people were there actually looking at them. Oh, this is where the crowd, doubled over. And so you're questioning back to those images instead of the words, right? And then from there, we say things like, great, from all of your pictures, what was the main idea of the story? What do you picture happening next? Why do you picture that they were having this contest? Why do you picture we wouldn't be having this contest nowadays, right? All of those good higher order thinking types of activities you want, right? Were there any other questions in there, Sam?
Nope, that's it for the time being.
Okay, great. All right. So if I go back, y'all are in Arizona, so the programs are approved by the ADE. We talked about seeing stars as relating to students' ability to decode. Visualizing and verbalizing is what we were just focused on, right? That's dealing with oral and written language comprehension. The LIPS program is also approved. LIPS is a great program for speech and language pathologists because it really aligns to how SLPs come to the reading process. It's focused on developing articulatory feedback to anchor phonemic awareness. And then there is the Talkies program. And Talkies you can think about as almost a pre-visualizing and verbalizing, right? The Talkies program is for students who have very little expressive language, right? They may be echolalic, and so they're not really attaching meaning to the words that they're using. And so the Talkies program is designed to help them begin connecting individual words and imagery, becoming talking students, so that, with the knowledge that ultimately they're going to move into the visualizing and verbalizing program. Okay. So those are the programs approved by the ADE. I had some other slides in here. I can't remember. Oh, we talked about Fort Smith earlier, and I did want to talk a little bit about special education and what we saw there in Fort Smith. From the years 2013 through 2017, Fort Smith exited about 86 students from special education. When they started to implement Linda Mood Bell with those students, from 2017 through 2021, they exited 226 kids from special education, right? And I think one of the big things that I mentioned earlier, and I'll reemphasize now, is that A lot of kids are in special education that don't need to be in special education, right? They just need the right instruction, they just need the right intervention, and we can move them out of special education. And then special education can be for the kids who really do need to be in special education, and it would change what's happening. Um, Many special education teachers, and I ran into this again with my own son, getting him into special ed meant he actually jumped over the reading teacher at school and he went to the special ed teacher. And what did I find out about the special ed teacher? You guys can probably guess. She didn't know how to teach reading, right? That wasn't her focus. And so I had completely missed the boat for him in terms of where he went to. And that's the reality for a lot of special educators, is that they don't necessarily know how to teach reading because that's not what they're set up to do. And they may not have time in the day to actually run the type of intervention groups that need to get run for students who are struggling. All right. There we go. That was the abrupt end of the presentation. Sorry about that. Any other questions or thoughts from folks out there? Now that I can see all
Yeah,
of you.
we have another one in the chat
Okay,
here.
great.
At what point do kids seem to do this imagery with
Yeah.
automaticity? Yeah, where you don't have to explicitly teach the
Mm,
imagery as they read. I know variables play a part, such as disabilities,
yeah.
etc.
Yeah, I don't think that they're, if we're talking about when they should, I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I mean, I think about it's great to have been doing. I've actually been in education for over 25 years. My oldest kid is 15, and my understanding of what was happening changed radically, of course, when I had a kid. And I could see some of the intentionality. When you're looking at kids' books, they've all got lots of pictures in them, and they're very colorful. And there are pictures of movement, and they're very dynamic. And at a certain point, that goes away, right? Around second grade, third grade, all of a sudden there's not pictures in the books anymore. And that's because, so if you think about what the intentionality of that is, having all those pictures there is to help students connect with the words my mom or dad is reading to me are creating pictures, right? And hopefully that's becoming embedded, because at third grade, those pictures are going to get taken away. The expectation is that kids are making those pictures themselves. The reality is, in many cases, they are not. And so increasingly, we need to be consciously and intentionally helping them develop that. That's even more true in the world that we're in right now, in which kids get a lot of screen time, which is passive, and they are doing much less independent reading, which is when they would have opportunities to generate those images, right? And so I think that unfortunately we're seeing a lot more of this happen.
Excellent. Another question here. I think this is a great one. Dave, can you speak to what happens when the language in the passage is a little bit more abstract and therefore more
Mhm.
difficult to create that mental image?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's when you've got to, I think about visualizing and verbalizing. One of the areas where you can really apply it over to is math and math word problems, right? Because math word problems are all about concept imagery. And then as you think about science and words like hypothesis, right? Or other content areas that you're picturing for, you're going to be doing a very similar process, right? You probably won't be breaking it down a sentence at a time and saying, what do you picture for that sentence? Instead, you might be looking at a whole paragraph and saying, what do those words make you picture? But you still want to be going back to that same sort of language around picturing, because this is something that we need our students to be doing all the time and applying over to all of their content material, right? So it is going to be trickier. That's why we want to start with content that is easier to picture for, knowing that in our pacing of the program, we're going to start to increase both the amount of information that students picturing for, as well as the complexity of it, by raising the grade level of the content that we're asking them to picture for, right? And what I'd encourage you to think about is this is a process, right? You're developing quite literally a muscle in the brain, and the more that you do it, the more that's going to be able to develop and get to a point at which a student's not having to consciously think about it. They're automatically creating that imagery.
Awesome. That's very helpful. Um, Going back to what you were saying about when your youngsters have
Yeah.
pictures in their books, do you find that those pictures in the early books inhibit development of individual imagery within a student's mind, or does it actually
Mm.
help them create more mental pictures that they can use later on independently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think ideally we'd be doing some of both, right? That you'd be reading a child a book that has lots of pictures in it, and then also doing some storytelling when they're not looking at the pictures, so that they're given that opportunity to try to create the images, right? And again, I'd tie over that one of the easiest ways to do this is through gestures, right? And so when you're reading about a character from a book, be asking questions like, well, what do you picture for their hair? What color are you picturing? Are you picturing long hair? Are you picturing curly hair? What are you picturing for that, right? And then they could always go back to the book and compare it and see it. Did we picture it correctly? Or, oh, how it's different in the book, right? So having that sort of interplay, I think, could be great. What I want to try to stay away from is the videos, right?
Hmm.
Because then that really is a passive activity.
Well, that goes back to what you were talking about throughout the session of that Socratic questioning method and leaving it more unscripted, but really
Mhm.
authentically responding to the students' ideas, and that back and forth is so important. That's great.
Yeah, and there's audiobooks and things like that. I grew up with books on tape that my parents would play in the car, and you'd be listening to those on long, boring car rides. But that that was important. I think it was
Yeah,
probably really important to how I created imagery rather than being on my iPad and watching something, right?
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dave. It looks like the questions have kind of trickled
Great.
out here, but really,
Awesome.
truly, thank you. This was absolutely incredible. And Jean, excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, even commented this info is very, very helpful along with the
Oh, great.
practice that was presented. So
Yeah.
we really appreciate you coming out this morning and sharing your expertise with us. I personally learned a lot about how to develop concept imagery to improve comprehension. And I'm definitely going to be keeping these strategies in mind as I work with my own students this week and moving forward in general.
Nice.
So thank you again. It is 11 o'clock, but we really appreciate you guys being here, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks all of you.